Welcome back to the discussion, Securely Managing Access and Identity in Government, sponsored by Radiant Logic on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guest today is Dieter Schuler, Vice President of Business Development at Radiant Logic. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy. You know, everyone's read about Edward Snowden, and we all know that he had the keys to the kingdom. He could have access to just about everything. And just last week, I was talking to a guy named General Earl Matthews. He led the red team at the Air Force, and he said, look, the bad guys are inside the wall. You know, you don't worry about your edge, worry about what's right in front of you, which is he called granular access. So this is exactly what you play with, isn't it?
This is one of the areas that we have a tremendous amount of value around. And I'll give you an example, some of the work that we've done with NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and NCCOE in conjunction with MITRE, where they put together a blueprint and a lab for effectively managing access rights. And the challenge is always, if you don't have the ability to provide access at a granular enough level, you end up giving people access to more than they need, right? And it's the more than they need that usually causes the problem. And your example with Snowden is a, great example of that, right? So what we've done there is worked with NIST and NCCOE to put together a lab that shows in an environment where systems are fragmented, where they're often incompatible, where they operate in isolation, and where that whole system and process is prone to errors, inconsistencies, and as a result, the opportunity for people to exploit, both from an insider perspective as well as an attacker perspective. The lab basically shows a way to centrally issue and validate and modify or revoke access rights based on very easy to understand business rules. And when you can do that, what you've done is you've put the control in the hands of the people that are making the business decisions, and you've provided a way to provide access to only things that people should have without giving them too much.
And this access isn't cast in granite somewhere. You know, it's changing all the time.
Yeah.
There's changing access. There's limiting time, so it's changing the level of access, a certain amount of time available for the access. And then the data itself can change, and that access can be dynamic with that. This is not a moving target. This is a target in 3 or 4 dimensions, changing hourly.
Absolutely, it's extremely complex. And if you have the ability to, all of this in an ideal world is based on the data that exists about the user. And if you have the ability to understand in real time that information about this user has changed, then your access policies can reflect that, and your decision policies can reflect that. So if your access is based on the fact that somebody is in a particular location, they're working on a particular project, they have a specific type of clearance, if they're no longer part of that project, if you don't know that, then they have access to things that they probably shouldn't have access to. So all of this has to be delivered at the speed of a directory, because these decisions about who can do what are made in real time. And the foundational components that are required to make this work are the ability to proxy back to all the underlying systems that have this data, and or, if you look at more of the meta directory world, understand that something has changed in these systems and reflect that in a cache or some sort of a persistent data store that you know you can rely on.
A framework, that's what you provide.
Exactly.
Yeah. In many ways, it's similar to what VMware did maybe 10, 15 years ago, where they're providing a framework to dynamically access storage.
If you look at VMware, it's a great example. The value that VMware provided for operating systems and hardware was it made the investments that people had much more reusable. If you take that same concept and you apply it to virtualizing identity, you can start to see that if you have made investments in all sorts of existing identity stores, and you make that more flexible and reusable for all your new initiatives, what the value prop starts to become there.
We're right here in Washington, D.C. We know every 4 years there's big changes in the federal government. But also, you know, I have friends work for the federal government, and many times they don't start at one agency and spend 30 years at one agency. They may move from agency to agency to agency. And the question is, what about their access? What about their privileges at the new agency? Do you just carry that along with you? Start from scratch? I mean, this is another component in this dynamic capability of access, is that not only is the data changing, but the humans are changing from agency. So he may have one level in one agency, all of a sudden it drops down to nothing.
Absolutely. And today he might be a contractor, tomorrow he might be an employee. We saw this with a number of agencies in the DoD, where that same person exists multiple times because they have different personas, because they had different interactions at different times. We see that in the world of healthcare and higher ed, where somebody is a student and a patient. So understanding that it's the same person across all these different systems, and being able to deliver the context about that person, depending on the interaction,
on
is
their
absolutely
attributes.
critical.
Yeah, you talk about attributes earlier. I was touring a data center a couple weeks back, and I thought of this phrase: guns, guards, and gates. And there's all kinds of protection. I mean, you can't even believe some of the protection they have in these data centers here. But physical access is one thing, but there's changing technology. There's remote access, by the way. There's dynamically increasing the number of users. There's responding to an identity challenge. Now, there, timely manner we brought up earlier is that, if a general walks in the door and he's challenged, he's not going to wait 15 minutes. You got to have that answer quickly, don't you?
Absolutely. And there's not much difference really between physical access and digital access, right? It's just a different type of resource. And if you can understand holistically all of the different access and manage it centrally, that buys you a lot. And for different interactions, there's different types of authentication that need to take place, or potentially even different types of authorization, right? So if you're interacting with me just to read a document, right, that's very different than if you were to do a financial transaction with me, right? So I need to take that into account as well. And the ability to understand that context of the user is absolutely critical for those types of interactions.
I think the listeners should know that your company's been in business since 2000. And when MITRE partners with a company, they don't go grab someone from the 7-Eleven and partner with them on identity management. So you have a very well-respected identity outside the federal government and within the federal government as well. So when you talk about NIST and MITRE, these are serious players in this game of identity management.
Absolutely. And we've seen this challenge across not only the IC and the DoD, but also some of the other agencies like DHS or VA or USDA or Department of Justice. And it's generally the same set of problems articulated slightly differently every single time.
We're completely different from every other agency. Oh, really? Yeah, yes. We have people have to have remote access, and it changes. Oh, that's new, isn't it? Yeah. So if you can have a framework that's adaptable, that's a way to produce these services that are efficient for the federal government.
Yeah, the way to think about it is an identity dial tone. If I'm traveling to Europe and I have an appliance that has a plug that's different than the outlet, I either have to change the plug or change the outlet, or I have to buy a converter. If I have a converter that's flexible enough, I can plug in anything into any outlet and it works.
Perfect. We're going to pause here for a short break. My guest today is Dieter Schuler, Vice President of Business Development at Radiant Logic. I'm your moderator, John Gilroy, on the discussion, Securely Managing Access and Identity in Government, sponsored by Radiant Logic on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.